I'm very pleased to be here to present a paper which is joint work with Suzanne Rowetter and Michael Hurt, who is also present at the conference here today. So I'm going to present the paper with the title Home Production as a Substitute to Market Consumption. And to motivate the paper, well, most of the analysis of well-being have mainly relied on either measures of income or on measures of spending. And although we know that most of the or using the measure of consumption spending is a better way to approximate well-being than the measure of income, there's one thing that both types of measures tend to neglect, and that is the factor of time. Well, and this factor time was first studied by, in the seminal work of Gary Becker in '65. And I think that Aguiar and Hurst, that they nicely phrase what this factor of time actually implies for the analysis of well-being. Because what they say is that the factor time, that it can be used to increase consumption beyond market spending. So if you would only include market consumption spending as a measure of consumption, you might actually not take into account the consumption that one can consume by, for example, home production. So you might underestimate the actual well-being of households and other people. So why is this interesting from a social point of view? Well, time, or the factor time, can be, of course, a considerable endowment in especially low-income households. You can think of households that are unemployed, households that are retired. They have a considerable amount of free time or non-working time that they can use to do some home production and increase their well-being beyond what a measure of solely spending could measure. Well, what this theory of Becker, it's quite of a simple theory in essence, and to convince you about that, Becker was the first to see consumption as a production of two input factors. So these two input factors are, one, market spending, and two, time. So basically, you could have the same product with different inputs. You can either have, for example, the money-intensive version of the product. So that means that that it is produced by market spending mainly and not by a lot of investing time in it. Or you can have the time-intensive goods. So you don't have a lot of market spending in the product, but you do have a lot of time spent in the product. So you can think of a tomato that you can either buy on the market or you can grow it yourself. That's basically the extreme idea of the money-intensive good and the time-intensive good. So in a static view, Becker more or less said that the composition of the consumption bundle depends on the relative price of time. So people with a relatively low wage tend to have more consumption that is time-intensive instead of money-intensive. While on the other hand, people with higher wages tend to have a consumption bundle consisting of products that are more money-intensive than time-intensive. So that is the static view of what this factor time implies in the model of Gary Becker. The somewhat more dynamic view is also that there might be a shift in the composition of the consumption bundle as soon as the price of time changes. So if there's a shock to the price of time, so there's a shock to the wage, people might actually want to substitute one type of consumption for the other type of consumption. So you can switch from the money-intensive version to the time-intensive version of the good. Well, do we see empirical evidence for this? Absolutely. So as Hicks mentions really nicely, is that home production can actually smooth consumption or well-being in response to shock. So people shifting away from the money-intensive version of the good towards the time-intensive version of the good. Well, here we have a couple of examples, so retirement, unemployment, health, wealth, etc. So what Aguiar and Hurst, for example, show is that when people retire, their home production increases. So the time spent in producing consumption increases. We also see that for unemployed households, The results are a bit more tricky or a bit more diverse when focusing on home production and a shock in health, because when you want to do some home production, you need to be at least a bit healthy. But still there is evidence that people react in terms of time allocation to shocks in health. And of course there's also evidence that home production responds to a shock in wealth. Well, what is the problem with 3 out of 4 of these transitory shocks? And then I'm focusing on retirement, unemployment, and health, is that it is unclear what actually happens when people or households face this shock. So what happens when someone becomes unemployed? Basically, 2 things change at the same time. So their monetary budget changes as well as their time budget changes. So they lose some income, but they also get some additional non-working time. So if we see people substituting or starting to produce consumption more at home, does that mean that it's actual substitution? So do you really substitute the tomato on the market for the homegrown tomato? Or is it the time endowment? It's simply because you have more time that you start growing the tomato yourself. Well, there have been several attempts to focus somewhat more on the actual substitution between market consumption and home production. And well, the macroeconomic approach is more like a theoretical approach in which they simulated the elasticity of home production with respect to consumption. A good example is the paper by Campbell and Ludvigsen. And what most of these papers find is an elasticity in the range of 0 to 5. So it can be either really small, but many of these macroeconomic models assume a high substitutability between home production and market consumption. Well, there are also a couple of papers focusing on the microeconomic approach, or a somewhat more econometric approach. And most of these papers find a, well, substantially smaller elasticity of around 2. The macro and the micro elasticity do not need to be inconsistent with each other, but still what is interesting to see about these microeconomic approaches is that they either use quite disputable instruments, like using a lag consumption, like Rupert et al., or they use a very specific subsample and the EITC, like Gelber and Mitchell. And one of the most recent papers uses permanent shocks in income. And what the problem here is that most of the identification, or all the identification, comes from these cross-sectional differences between poorer and richer households. So what we try to fill the gap in this microeconomic approach. And how do we do that? Well, our main contribution is that we estimate an intra-temporal microelasticity from within person information. So we follow people over time, and we use this shock in wealth eventually. So basically we try to find an answer to the question, to what extent can people substitute away from market consumption to home production. And the causal identification comes from 2 factors, which I will elaborate a bit more on these assumptions in the remaining of the presentation. But it basically comes down to that we use a large exogenous shock in wealth, namely the house prices during the Great Recession. And we assume that these wealth shocks were unanticipated and large enough to have an influence on market consumption possibilities. And the idea of using the house prices in the Great Recession is not new at all, because there are other papers who focused on the effect of these declines in house prices on consumption and home production, but we really tried to connect the 2 and to estimate this elasticity that we're talking about. Well, a minor contribution is that we have very specific and detailed data. So most of the data that is used before has either a lot of information about consumption spending, or you have a lot of information about time use. There are some data sets that have both, but they're imperfect. It's either a cross-section, or you only have information about food. There are some data sets that have both, but they do not focus on the US. So we have a data set that uses information from US households. Well, what does this data look like? Well, HRS is probably quite familiar to most of you. And what we do is that we connect this health and retirement survey to the so-called Consumption and Activities Mail Survey, the CAMS, which is a supplement to the HRS. And the most interesting thing about doing this is that you end up having a lot of detailed information about time use, as well as a lot of detailed information about consumption spending. Luckily, we have access to 4 waves, and 2 of these waves are prior to the Great Recession, and 2 of these waves are after the Great Recession. So we can use that for our identification purposes. Coming to the definition of home production, or the question what home production is, and basically when I take a look at this, I would define it as all the chores that I just dislike doing at home. Of course, we need a somewhat more scientific view on that, and therefore we follow the definition used by Aguiar et al. And by doing this, we more or less, well, park the discussion of what home production actually is. So as you can see, some of these home production categories are quite arbitrary, whether it's true leisure or whether it's home production. You can think about people really loving gardening. To one person, this may be home production. To the other person, there might be some leisure component to that. So we park that discussion and we define home production as the sum of these time use categories and follow Aguiar et al. Now, what can home production actually substitute for? So there should be a couple of counterparts that you can buy on the market. So for example, when we take a look at the house cleaning, you can either do the house cleaning yourself or you can buy housekeeping services. So we try to find a counterpart that you can buy on the market for each of these time use categories. Well, for some of them, you simply cannot find a complement. For example, financial management or shopping. There's not really a market complement to that. To give you some idea about what this data looks like and how the descriptives show, here we have a table with the consumption spending across time. So these are in dollars per year. And here we have total consumption over the 4 waves. Here we have what we call the substitutable consumption, so the market consumption that could be substituted for by home production activities. And here are the components of this substitutable consumption. What we can show first is, of course, that most of these people actually have some form of substitutable consumption. So about 98% has market consumption spending that could be substituted for by home production. So in that sense, we're not really worried about this so-called left censoring. But focusing on the pre-Great Recession wave and the post-Great Recession wave, it's interesting to see that the substitutable consumption part is not that big when you compare it to the total consumption. So it's only about 12% of total consumption that is spent on products that could be substituted for by home production. So that's the first remark, that the scope of substitution is fairly small. Another interesting finding in this table is that when we take a look at the 2 columns, is that there's a decrease of about 16% in substitutable home consumption, while there's only a decrease of about 7% in total consumption. So from this table, we can see that the substitutable consumption is more responsive to the cycle than total consumption. Of course, that could be the case because people find it easier to substitute away from this type of consumption. So what you would expect is that you would also see this with the time use category. So you would, that the time use categories or the time spent in home production would increase. Do we find that in this table? No, absolutely not. So we do not find increases in time spent in home production. But for the sake of space, what I didn't show here is that the standard deviations are quite high. So there's a lot of cross-sectional variation of people spending time in these home production activities, although almost everyone spends at least some time in the home production activities. But therefore, we really would like to see the within-person variation over time. And before we come to the empirical model, to do so, we try to embed the idea or the identification procedure in a theoretical framework. And please don't misinterpret this slide. So we're not trying to solve this life cycle model or estimate this structural econometric model. We're just estimating a reduced form model. But it gives some nice idea of what is going on in our identification strategy. So our basis is just a simple life cycle model, and we augment it in two ways. So the first way is that we include home production, denoted in red, and the other way is that we allow for shocks in financial wealth, and you'll see that on the next slide. So we include, next to market consumption and leisure, we include consumption based on home production. So this is the consumption produced at home. Well, what does this look like? Most of the papers say, okay, you have this transformation function transforming the time spent in home production into the output of this consumption product. So basically, you could see this function G as you water the tomato plant, and at some point the tomato pops up. That's the idea of it. Furthermore, we have market consumption, but we also know that some of the market consumption cannot be substituted for by home production. So we have a part that you can substitute, and we have a part that you cannot substitute. Another important remark is that we only focus on retirees. So we assume that there are no labor supply choices anymore, and that is because of our identification strategy, but I'll focus on that in one of the next slides. So of course, you need to maximize the remaining utility over the lifetime with respect to the time budget, which excludes the labor supply decision because we're only focusing on retirees, and we have our monetary budget. And in the normal case, you would have just the A here. So your wealth grows deterministically. And what we assume is that there can be shocks to this wealth. So it's not determined deterministically, but it's stochastic. So this psi might be a shock. And of course, the wealth can consist of financial wealth as well as housing wealth. And in our case, we specifically focus on the housing wealth, of course. Now, coming to the empirical model, we are interested in estimating the effect or how home production reacts to changes in the consumption that can be substituted for. So beta N2 would be the coefficient that would estimate the elasticity. However, of course, the two are determined simultaneously. So therefore, we need a first stage with an instrument, and like with all instruments, it needs to be relevant as well as valid. So we try to find a valid instrument, and what we do is that here we use the shocks in house prices during the Great Recession. What does that look like? That is this shock. So this is the shock in house prices during the Great Recession. Now, why can we use this as an instrument? Why is it a valid instrument? Well, first of all, it enters the monetary budget. So a negative shock would mean that it decreases your market consumption possibilities, but at the same time there's no direct effect on the decision of home production. So it does not enter the time budget. So people might only want to change their time allocation because of changes in their monetary budget and therefore changes in their consumption possibilities. Well, why is the instrument relevant? There are some theoretical papers that have given it some thought about the mechanism of housing wealth and consumption. And Campbell and Coco, for example, they argued that it is perceived health or borrowing constraints why shocks in housing might lead to different consumption behavior. Another way, another mechanism could be the mechanism defined by Kopchuk and Lupton. It's the bequest motive. Well, do we see this in the empirics as well? So absolutely, there is some empirical evidence on what we call the so-called marginal propensity to consume. So the consumption changes because of changes in the housing wealth. And in general, we see this, for example, in these papers. Interestingly, Campbell and Coco show that the MPC is especially high among somewhat older households. And interesting for our case is that there are two papers taking a look at the effect of the Great Recession on consumption spending. And this is the paper by Angrasani and others, and Christelis and others. So when we estimate this model on the subset of retirees who own a house, we come up with the following elasticity, or the following coefficient. This means that this is the elasticity. What does this elasticity imply? So this elasticity means that when there's a 1% change or decline in consumption possibilities, then home production would increase by 0.65%. Is it big or small? Well, of course, it's less than a perfect substitute because it's between 0 and -1. But still, it's bigger than the elasticity found by Higgs, for example. And when you take a look at the average effect, we come to the conclusion that the shadow wage would be about $5.30, which is somewhat lower than the minimum wage in most of the states in the US. But Guess and Becker argued that that could be reasonable because of looking at people in retirement. Well, of course, we also wanted to put a finger on where this elasticity more or less comes from. So we sum up some of these groups that tend to have a somewhat higher elasticity or that tend to drive the elasticity, and these are mainly the, well, quote unquote, the young retirees, so the younger, the people with a relatively low age in retirement. The people who are relatively healthy, so you can actually also perform the home production. Of course, it's also related to some financial issues, but let me mainly stress this high, the people with a lot of consumption that could be substituted for by home production tend to have a higher elasticity, and people who tend to have not that much time spent in home production. So this means basically these last two that you have a lot of scope for substitution. Well, this is an interesting fact because what do we know from retirees is that they especially with respect to market consumption and time spent in home production that they might differ from non-retirees. So what we see here is that when focusing on time spent in home production activities, that retirees have spent significantly more time in home production than non-retirees. The other way around, so we see that retired households, that they spend a lot less on the market, market consumption that could be substituted for. Well, why is this interesting? This could imply that the elasticity that we find that it's quite of a lower bound because people who are not retired could have a lot more scope for this substitution. So coming to the conclusion, we find, well, small, it's only relative, it's less than a perfect substitute, but it's relatively large compared to an earlier study by Higgs, but still it's relatively small to the earlier microeconomic studies finding an elasticity of about 2. Interestingly, there's high substitutability assumed in theoretical models, and we argue at least that our estimates are quite of a credible lower bound. But still, we really need to keep in mind that the actual scope for substitution is fairly small. It's only the 12% of total consumption that is devoted to this type of consumption that could be substituted for by home production. But still, the main conclusion, I think, is that there are still non-negligible possibilities to substitute away from this consumption, meaning that if you would only focus on consumption spending, you would underestimate the well-being of people, especially focusing on what happens with well-being when people face a shock. Thank you.